There stands today, along a winding stretch of the Connecticut River in Oakdale, Long Island, a mansion of red brick and gray stone that holds within its deteriorating walls a story far darker than the fairy tale its architecture suggests, a palace built on railroad millions, consumed twice by flame, abandoned by history, and left to crumble into the same dust from which it rose. And if these walls could speak, what would they tell you about the price of grandeur, about the invisible hands that polished every surface and tended every flower, about the desperate social climbing of America's nouveau riches, about marriages built on ambition rather than love, about the frantic construction of identity through architecture, and most haunting of all, about how even the most solid-seeming monuments to wealth and power can vanish as if they were never there at all. This is the story of Idle Hour, a 110-room colossus that embodied the Gilded Age's most intoxicating promise, that enough money could buy anything, even permanence, even belonging, even escape from the grinding judgment of old society, and this is also the story of how that promise was a lie, because Idle Hour would burn, be rebuilt, burn again in slower motion through neglect, and ultimately stand as a monument not to achievement but to the futility of trying to build forever when you're standing on the shifting sands of American capitalism, where fortunes evaporate as quickly as they're made, where dynasties dissolve within 3 generations, and where the grandest houses become first colleges, then bankruptcies, then real estate disputes, then nothing more than curiosities for urban explorers and local historians who wonder how something so massive could be so thoroughly forgotten. The question that haunts Idle Hour isn't, how was it built, but what dark bargains did it require, what human costs did it extract, and why, despite all that money and all that effort, couldn't it survive? To understand Idle Hour, you must first understand the hunger that built it, and that hunger belonged to 2 people whose union was less marriage than strategic alliance, less romance than corporate merger, 2 ambitious souls who saw in each other not love but opportunity, not partnership but leverage in the brutal social warfare of Gilded Age New York, where every dinner party was a battlefield, every invitation a calculated move, every mansion a declaration of war against those who would deny you entry to their world. William Kissam Vanderbilt, Willie K., to his set, though never, ever to his servants, who would have been dismissed immediately for such familiarity, inherited his slice of the Commodore's railroad empire in 1877, receiving a fortune so vast it seemed inexhaustible, $3 million that in today's money would be worth somewhere north of $80 million but which, in terms of purchasing power and relative wealth in an era before income tax, before estate tax, before any of the mechanisms designed to prevent the accumulation of dynastic fortunes, functioned more like several billion, enough money that Willie K. would never, in his entire life, need to work, need to produce anything, need to justify his existence beyond simply existing as proof that the Vanderbilt name mattered. That Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt's brutal consolidation of railroad power and ruthless elimination of competition had created something that would last beyond a single generation, something that could be inherited, that could transform mere wealth into dynasty, into permanence, into the American equivalent of European aristocracy. But Willie K. faced the existential crisis that haunts all inheritors of great wealth. What do you do when you've never had to do anything, when your grandfather built the empire through sheer force of will and absolute ruthlessness, when your father maintained it through cautious competence, when your only job is to exist, to spend, to demonstrate through consumption that you deserve this fortune you did nothing to earn, and when the old money families of New York, the descendants of Dutch colonial landowners and Revolutionary War profiteers, look at you with barely concealed contempt, seeing not a gentleman but a railroad heir, not aristocracy but the grandson of a man who started with a ferry boat and ended with an empire, which in their eyes meant new money, meant crude money, meant money that smelled of coal smoke and corrupted politicians and workers crushed under locomotives, money that could never, regardless of how many generations passed, transform into the effortless gentility they believed they possessed by birthright. His wife Alva, born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, daughter of a cotton merchant who'd been ruined by the Civil War, who'd clawed her way from Southern poverty to New York society through sheer force of will, through determination hardened into diamond by years of social rejection and condescension, through ambition that transformed every slight into fuel, every closed door into a challenge to be overcome, understood something Willie K. never quite grasped, something that would define not just Idle Hour but the entire trajectory of Gilded Age social climbing, that in America, where old money barely existed and new money was everywhere, where fortunes were made and lost within single lifetimes, where the entire social structure was fluid and contingent rather than fixed and hereditary. You didn't inherit social position, you performed it, you built it. You staged it with houses and parties and strategic marriages and, most crucially, with the absolute conviction that you belonged. That you had every right to occupy the spaces others claimed as their exclusive territory. Alva had learned young that prettiness wasn't enough, that charm wasn't enough, that even marrying a Vanderbilt wasn't enough. You had to force recognition, had to make yourself impossible to ignore, had to spend so spectacularly, entertain so lavishly, display such perfect taste that even those who hated you would be compelled to acknowledge your existence, to accept your invitations, to eventually, grudgingly, admit you to their world, and if you did it correctly, if you played the game with sufficient ruthlessness and strategic brilliance, you could actually rewrite your own origin story, could become, through sheer spectacular expenditure and tactical social warfare, the very thing society initially denied you could be, could transform yourself from Alabama poverty to Manhattan queen, from rejected outsider to arbiter of taste, from the woman nobody wanted at their parties to the woman whose parties everyone desperately wanted to attend. So in 1876, Willie K. purchased 900 acres along the Great South Bay and the Connecticut River in Oakdale, Long Island, then a remote stretch of marshland and pine barrens and dense forest that wealthy New Yorkers were just beginning to recognize as prime hunting and sporting territory, a place where men could play at being country gentlemen, could shoot waterfowl in the fall and deer in winter, could fish for trout in pristine streams, could pretend to a pastoral English aristocracy there. Grandfathers never possessed, could create, in other words, an alternate identity rooted not in American industrialization but in the European landed gentry they simultaneously resented and desperately wanted to emulate, and together with Alva, he commissioned Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the architect who would define American mansion architecture for a generation, to design a wooden Queen Anne-style country retreat, a lavish 110-room house they would name, with revealing irony that probably seemed clever at the time but which now reads as almost tragic, Idle Hour, because this was where one came to do nothing, to escape the supposed rigors of running railroads and managing investments and sitting on corporate boards, though of course, doing nothing, for the Vanderbilts meant employing dozens upon dozens of servants who worked 16-hour days, 6.5 days a week, to maintain the illusion of effortless leisure, to create an environment where the family never had to think about cooking or cleaning or maintaining or organizing, where every possible need was anticipated and met before it could even be articulated, where comfort was so complete, so total, so absolute that it became invisible, became simply the natural state of existence rather than something that required constant, exhausting, soul-crushing labor by an entire class of people whose names we don't know, whose faces appear in no photographs, whose stories died with them, leaving only fragmentary evidence in household account books and the occasional newspaper notice of a servant's death or injury. Construction began in 1878, and what rose from those mosquito-infested acres over the next several years was something unprecedented in American domestic architecture, not just a house but a complete alternate reality, a self-contained universe, a miniature kingdom that included not only the main mansion with its 110 rooms, and think about that number, 110 rooms. More rooms than most people would visit in a year of their lives, more rooms than most villages had in total, rooms for every possible function and many functions that existed purely to demonstrate that you could afford to have rooms for them, but also a powerhouse to generate electricity for this estate that functioned as its own small city, a stable complex that rivaled most people's homes in both size and luxury, with carved mahogany stalls for horses worth more than working families earned in a lifetime, with brass fixtures polished daily by stable boys whose hands bled from the work, with a tack room that could have been a gentleman's study, with living quarters for grooms and coachmen that were nevertheless far superior to the housing most workers could afford, a private paddle-wheel steamer named the Mosquito to ferry guests up and down the Connecticut River in perfect comfort, kennels for hunting dogs that received better medical care than most Americans, greenhouses for orchids and exotic plants that required full-time gardeners to maintain the precise temperature and humidity needed for species that had no business surviving a Long Island winter, a dairy farm with prize cattle that produced fresh milk and butter and cream for the family, a private fire department, ironic, tragic, devastating given what would come, complete with equipment and trained firefighters on constant standby, and eventually 290 to 300 buildings scattered across the 900-acre estate, creating virtually a private town. A Vanderbilt fiefdom where every single structure, every single person you encountered, from the gatekeeper who controlled access to this private kingdom to the night watchman who patrolled the grounds to prevent intrusion or theft to the scullery maid scrubbing pots in the basement kitchen at midnight, existed in relation to the family, their entire purpose defined by Vanderbilt comfort, Vanderbilt convenience, Vanderbilt whims, their entire identity subsumed into their function as extensions of the family's will, as living tools to be used and, when they wore out or made mistakes or simply became inconvenient, to be replaced with no more thought than you'd give to replacing a broken hammer. But who were these people, these invisible hands that made idle hour function, that transformed it from empty rooms into a living, breathing performance of leisure and luxury? They were, overwhelmingly, immigrants, Irish men and women fleeing the ongoing economic devastation of post-famine Ireland, where British colonial policies had created a permanent underclass desperate enough to cross the Atlantic for any opportunity, any wage, any escape from generational poverty. Italian stonemasons and craftsmen seeking better wages than they could earn in villages where centuries of work had already claimed every available opportunity, German gardeners trained in the great estates of Prussia and Bavaria, French chefs and English butlers who brought with them the practices and pretensions of European aristocracy, and local Long Island women and men, descendants of colonial farmers and fishermen, who needed work and would endure the rigid hierarchy below stairs, the exhausting hours, the constant surveillance, the psychological toll of invisibility, for $20 to $30 monthly plus room and board, which meant sleeping in uninsulated attic rooms that baked in summer's brutal heat and froze in winter's bone numbing cold, which meant working from 6 in the morning when you'd light fires and begin breakfast preparation until 10 or 11 at night when the family finally finished entertaining and you could begin the hours of cleaning and organizing and preparing for tomorrow, which meant wearing uniforms provided by the household that marked you as property, as belonging to the Vanderbilts rather than to yourself, which meant eating only after the family had finished, consuming their leftovers. Never tasting the finest preparations, never sitting at the elaborate tables you'd spend hours setting, which meant never using the front door, never walking on the same paths the family used, never sitting in their presence unless ordered to do so for some specific purpose, which meant never speaking unless spoken to, never offering opinions, never revealing your own thoughts or feelings or humanity, and above all, above everything else, never, ever letting the family see the machinery of service, the exhaustion, the resentment, the sore hands and aching backs, the sheer physical toll of maintaining grandeur, because the entire performance depended on the servants being simultaneously indispensable and invisible, essential and effaced, present and absent, human enough to perform complex tasks but inhuman enough to not require the acknowledgement, the courtesy, the basic dignity that the family extended to each other and to their social equals. A Gilded Age mansion like Idle Hour required what amounted to a private army, a rigidly hierarchical organization that mirrored military structure, at the top, a butler to oversee all male staff, to manage the wine cellar with its thousands of bottles of imported champagne and claret and port, to train footmen in the precise choreography of service, to maintain order below stairs with an authority that was absolute and often brutal, and a housekeeper to command all female servants, to maintain inventories of linens and china and silver, to ensure that every room met exacting standards of cleanliness, to hire and fire maids, to keep every secret the family wanted kept, and to serve, essentially, as the invisible prime minister of this domestic empire. Below them, a complex hierarchy of specialized servants, each with specific duties that could not be transgressed without risking chaos or, worse, dismissal. Footmen in elaborate livery to serve at table with practiced precision, to answer doors, to carry messages, to stand at attention during formal dinners in a display of the family's ability to command human ornaments, a lady's maid for Alva who would dress her, because ladies of this class did not dress themselves, did not know how to manage the dozens of buttons and hooks and lacings of contemporary fashion, who would style her hair, pack for trips, manage her jewelry and correspondence, and above all keep every secret, every confidence, every glimpse of the real human woman beneath the social performance, a valet for Willie K., to manage his wardrobe, lay out his clothes, pack his trunks, attend to every detail of his presentation, chambermaids to clean bedrooms and make beds with military precision, to empty chamber pots before indoor plumbing, to maintain the intimate spaces of family life while remaining utterly anonymous, utterly forgettable, human furniture that arranged other furniture, parlor maids to maintain public spaces, to dust the endless objects Alva collected to demonstrate taste, to polish silver and brass until they gleamed, to ensure that every surface the family or their guests might touch was perfect, kitchen maids to assist the cook, to wash dishes, to scrub floors, to maintain the enormous coal stoves that required constant feeding and cleaning, to prepare vegetables, to pluck chickens, to perform the brutally physical labor that transformation of raw ingredients into elaborate meals required, a chef and sous chefs, usually French or trained in French techniques, because French cuisine was the only cuisine that mattered to people of this class, who would create the multiple-course dinners that served as Alva's primary weapon in social warfare, 7, 8, 9 courses, each perfectly executed, each presented with theatrical flourish, each designed to demonstrate that the Vanderbilts could command any delicacy, any luxury, any taste that existed in the world, laundresses to wash mountains of linens and the elaborate clothing that required careful hand-washing, who would labor over steaming washtubs, whose hands would crack and bleed from lye soap, who would develop chronic back problems from the physical demands of washing and wringing and hanging and ironing, a night watchman to patrol the grounds, to prevent intrusion, to ensure that the family slept safely behind multiple layers of human surveillance, stable boys and grooms to care for the dozens of horses, to muck stalls, to polish tack, to exercise animals worth more than the boys' entire families would earn in their lifetimes, coachmen to drive the family, to maintain carriages, to present the Vanderbilts to the world with appropriate splendor, gardeners and groundskeepers to maintain the landscape, to create the illusion that this carefully constructed paradise was natural, was simply the way things were rather than the product of constant human intervention, and what the Vanderbilts delicately called a useful man, which was essentially a human Swiss Army knife of domestic labor, someone to handle whatever tasks didn't fit other job descriptions, to fix things, to move things, to do the dirty work that couldn't be assigned to more specialized servants, to be, in other words, the most exploited and least acknowledged member of an already exploited and unacknowledged workforce. Every single one of these people, and we're talking about 40, 50, 60 employees at peak seasons, an entire village worth of labor dedicated to the comfort of one family, understood that their employment depended on absolute discretion, perfect invisibility, and the suppression of their own humanity in service to the family's comfort, understood that one mistake, one moment of visible exhaustion or resentment, one failure to perform their role with absolute conviction, could result in immediate dismissal without references, which in an era before unemployment insurance, before worker protections of any kind, before social safety nets, meant potential destitution, meant the inability to find other work, meant shame and poverty and the destruction of whatever fragile security they'd managed to construct. The house Alva created within this framework of invisible labor was a stage set for her ambitions, room after room designed not for living but for impressing, for demonstrating that the Vanderbilts could match any European aristocrat's taste, could command any luxury, could deploy wealth as both weapon and shield against a society that didn't want them, the grand entrance hall with its carved oak staircase that announced, before you'd even removed your coat, that you had entered a space of wealth and power and carefully constructed taste, the drawing rooms, multiple drawing rooms because one was insufficient, filled with European antiques purchased not because Alva particularly loved them but because they signaled cultivation, because they were objects that required knowledge to appreciate, because they were conversation pieces that allowed her to demonstrate her education, her sophistication, her right to occupy spaces others claimed as their exclusive territory, the library, lined with leather-bound books that may or may not have been read but which performed the function of suggesting intellectual depth, the music room with its grand piano where accomplished young women, including daughter Consuelo, would perform for guests, the conservatory filled with exotic plants, the billiard room where men could retreat after dinner to smoke and drink and discuss business and politics while maintaining the fiction that they were simply enjoying leisure, and most importantly, the dining room where Alva could seat dozens for the elaborate multiple-course dinners that served as the primary theater of Gilded Age social warfare, each invitation a calculated move in her campaign to dominate New York society, each seating arrangement a message about who mattered and who didn't, each menu a demonstration that the Vanderbilts could afford tastes most Americans had never encountered and never would. Each dinner a performance that required dozens of servants working in invisible coordination to create the illusion that food simply appeared, perfectly prepared and perfectly timed, as if by magic rather than by exhausting human labor. This was the golden age of idle hour, the 1880s and early 1890s, when the house hummed with parties and political gatherings, when Willie K. brought his horses and his hunting dogs and his male friends to pursue the sporting life that defined masculine leisure in this era, when Alva orchestrated her social campaigns with the precision of a military general, when their daughter Consuelo, born in 1877, raised in this environment of spectacular wealth and limited freedom, who would later write devastating memoirs about her mother's tyrannical control and the crushing weight of Vanderbilt expectations, spent childhood summers along the river, learning, though she couldn't have articulated it then, that she herself was property, was an asset to be deployed strategically, was not a person with her own desires but a tool in her mother's relentless campaign for social dominance. And in 1895, Alva orchestrated her masterpiece, her ultimate demonstration that American money could overcome any barrier, could penetrate any closed circle, could achieve what had been considered impossible. She forced Consuelo, against her will, against her passionate objections, amid tears and threats and what Consuelo would later describe as psychological torture, to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, essentially purchasing a British title for her daughter with Vanderbilt Railroad money, paying the Duke's enormous debts in exchange for his name, proving that American wealth could penetrate even the most aristocratic bloodlines, that money, enough money, deployed strategically enough, could overcome centuries of tradition and prejudice and careful bloodline management, though the cost, the human cost that nobody counted because Consuelo's feelings didn't matter, her autonomy didn't matter, her happiness didn't matter in the face of Alva's ambition, was a loveless marriage, years of misery, eventual divorce, and psychological scars that would last Consuelo's entire life. But beneath this glittering surface, beneath the performances and the parties and the strategic marriages, darkness gathered like storm clouds over the Atlantic, because Alva's marriage to Willie K. was itself a performance, a business arrangement held together by social necessity rather than affection, and by the early 1890s the cracks were showing, impossible to ignore. Impossible to paper over with more parties or more houses or more spectacular expenditure, because Willie K. had taken up with a woman in Paris, was conducting an affair with an openness that bordered on contempt for his wife, flaunting his infidelities with an arrogance that suggested he believed his wealth made him immune to consequences, that he could do whatever he wanted because who was going to stop him, who was going to challenge a Vanderbilt, who was going to suggest that the same rules that governed ordinary people might apply to someone of his wealth and status? And here is where Alva revealed the steel beneath her silk gowns, the ruthlessness beneath the carefully cultivated refinement, because in December 1894 she did something almost unprecedented in Gilded Age society, something so bold it shocked even the tabloid-hungry press that fed on society scandals. She filed for divorce, not a quiet separation that would allow both parties to maintain public dignity, not a discreet arrangement where they lived separate lives while maintaining the fiction of marriage, but a public, scandalous, society-shaking divorce on grounds of adultery, a move so explosive it dominated newspapers for months, because divorce meant ostracization from upper-class society, meant social death for a woman of her class, meant losing everything she'd fought for, everything she'd built, all the social position she'd accumulated through decades of strategic effort. And yet Alva understood something Willie K. did not, something that would define the aftermath of their marriage, that she had become, through her own efforts, more socially powerful than he was, that her force of personality, her strategic brilliance, her absolute conviction in her own right to occupy space had made her, paradoxically, less dependent on him than he was on her, that she could survive scandal while he could not, that she had built her position not just on his money but on her own social genius, and that she could use the divorce to extract an enormous settlement, multiple estates, including the spectacular marble house in Newport, Rhode Island, millions in securities, enough money to maintain her lifestyle independently, and most importantly, her freedom, her ability to finally stop performing the role of devoted Vanderbilt wife and begin the next act of her life as a women's suffrage activist and twice-married socialite who had beaten the system at its own game, who had taken the Vanderbilt money and used it to fund her own independence, who had transformed from property into agent, from pawn into player, from victim of the marriage market into its master. Willie K., meanwhile, retained idle hour, this monument to a marriage that had always been more merger than love story, this physical embodiment of ambitions that were always primarily Alva's rather than his, and he must have walked through those 110 rooms after the divorce feeling the emptiness not just of her absence but of purpose itself, because idle hour had been built to stage Alva's social warfare, and without her, it was just a very large, very expensive house that required dozens of servants and constant maintenance and generated no meaning beyond demonstrating that he could afford to keep it. And then in 1899, his son, William Kissam Vanderbilt II, known as Willie K., Jr., a dashing young man of 21 who loved automobiles and yachts and speed, who would later set land speed records at Daytona Beach, who would defend the America's Cup in yacht racing, who would generally live the life of adventure and excitement his father never quite managed, whose passion for racing and technology suggested he might actually do something, might actually create something beyond just spending. Inherited money, married Virginia Graham Fair, herself an heiress to a vast mining fortune built by her father James Graham Fair in Nevada's Comstock Lode, bringing together two streams of American new money in a match that seemed, at least on the surface, to promise happiness, to suggest that this generation might escape the loveless strategic marriages that had defined their parents' generation. They chose idle hour for their honeymoon, this house where Willie K., Jr. had spent so many childhood summers, where he could show his bride the life of leisure and sporting that defined Vanderbilt identity, where they could begin their marriage surrounded by family history and the carefully maintained illusion of permanence, where they could imagine building their own version of Vanderbilt legacy, different from but connected to what had come before, and then, on the night of April 15, 1899, while the newlyweds slept in rooms that were supposed to be safe, in a house that was supposed to be a refuge, in the midst of what should have been the happiest moment of their young lives, fire broke out in the wooden mansion, flames that spread with terrifying speed through 110 rooms of elaborate woodwork and expensive furnishings and highly flammable Victorian textiles. Fire that seemed to ignite everywhere at once, that consumed room after room with an appetite that suggested something hungry, something deliberate, something that wanted not just to damage but to destroy completely, and Willie K., Jr. and Virginia Fair barely escaped with their lives, fleeing into the April night wearing whatever they could grab, nightclothes, robes, slippers wholly inadequate for the cold, as the entire structure behind them, 20 years of construction and additions and modifications, Alva's carefully curated collection of European treasures, the physical embodiment of Vanderbilt's social aspiration, burned to ash in a matter of hours, the flames visible for miles, drawing crowds of local residents who watched in horrified fascination as one of the greatest private houses in America simply ceased to exist, collapsing into itself in showers of sparks and ember, leaving only the stone foundations and the brick chimneys standing like tombstones in the smoking ruins, and leaving the overwhelming question that newspapers would obsess over for weeks: how did this happen? How did a mansion with a private fire department, with all the latest safety features, with constant human surveillance, manage to burn so completely and so quickly that even with firefighters on the property, nothing could be saved? The official story was vague, mentioning a possible defective flue, a problem with the heating system, some mundane mechanical failure that set off the catastrophe, but rumors circulated immediately and persistently. Had it been arson? Had disgruntled servants seeking revenge for some slight or punishment set the blaze? Had Willie K., Jr. himself, wanting to start fresh and build something modern and escape the weight of his parents' failed marriage embedded in every room, arranged it for the insurance money? Had the private fire department been ordered to let it burn? Had the fire been, in other words, not accident but murder, the deliberate killing of a house that had outlived its purpose? And the truth, lost to history, matters less than what the fire revealed, that all this grandeur was essentially kindling, that the performance of permanence had been built on the most temporary of materials, that you could spend millions and employ dozens and fill your house with European antiques purchased at vast expense, and it could all vanish in a single night, faster than it took to build, leaving nothing but charred timber and twisted metal and the acrid smell of destroyed ambition, leaving survivors standing in their nightclothes watching their past burn, realizing with horrible clarity that nothing is permanent, nothing is safe, nothing is actually solid regardless of how solid it seems. But here is where the Vanderbilt response becomes most telling. most characteristic of Gilded Age thinking, most revealing of the psychology that separated the very wealthy from everyone else, because Willie K. didn't abandon idle hour after the fire, didn't sell the land, didn't walk away from the place where his son's honeymoon had turned into nightmare, didn't interpret the fire as a sign that perhaps 900-acre private estates were unsustainable or that the Gilded Age model of living was already dying. No, he did the opposite. He rebuilt it, bigger, more elaborate, more permanent, more fireproof, commissioning Richard Howland Hunt, son of the original architect, to design not another wooden mansion but a palace of red brick and grey stone in the English country style, a structure that would cost $3 million, more than the entire original estate including land. A 70,000-square-foot mansion completed in 1901 that would stand, Willie K. must have believed with absolute conviction, for centuries, a Vanderbilt monument that fire couldn't touch, that time couldn't erode, proof that even disaster could be overcome with enough money, enough will, enough architectural ambition, proof that the Vanderbilts were not just wealthy but invincible, not just powerful but eternal, not just successful but destined to create a dynasty that would rival anything Europe had produced. The rebuilt idle hour was a marvel of turn-of-the-century construction, its interiors featuring the finest craftsmanship available in an era before mass production had destroyed artisanal tradition, oak-paneled libraries with carved details that represented hundreds of hours of skilled labor, marble fireplaces imported from European estates, each one unique, each one carrying its own history. A grand staircase of carved oak that announced your ascent from the everyday world into the rarefied atmosphere of Vanderbilt privilege. Electric lighting, still rare in private homes in 1901, powered by the estate's own generator, giving the house a modernity that most of America wouldn't experience for decades, modern plumbing with dozens of bathrooms, revolutionary in an era when many homes still used chamber pots, a sophisticated heating system designed to prevent the kind of failure that supposedly caused the first fire, and most importantly, construction designed with obsessive attention to fireproofing, steel frames and stone walls and compartmentalized spaces that theoretically could contain any fire before it spread, that would prevent, Willie K. believed, any repetition of the nightmare that had consumed the first house. But what Willie K. couldn't prevent, what money couldn't solve, what architecture couldn't address, was the slow fire of social change, the gradual burning away of the very world idle hour had been built to dominate, because the early 20th century brought challenges that steel frames and stone walls were useless against, the income tax, instituted in 1913, that made maintaining vast estates suddenly expensive in new ways, that required the wealthy to actually hand over portions of their fortunes to the government, that introduced the revolutionary concept that private wealth might have public obligations, World War I, which killed the sons of old families and shattered the illusion that European-style aristocracy could survive in democratic America, which exposed the brutality underlying all civilized pretensions, which made the Gilded Age obsession with aristocratic play-acting seem not just outdated but obscene, the gradual professionalization of American life that meant even wealthy young men were expected to do something, to have careers rather than just inheritances, to justify their existence through productivity rather than consumption. The women's suffrage movement, championed by Alva herself in her post-divorce life, that challenged the very foundations of patriarchal power that had made places like idle hour possible, and most devastatingly, the simple mathematics of Vanderbilt family expansion, because the Commodore's fortune, vast as it seemed, had to be divided among an ever-growing number of heirs, diluted across cousins and second cousins and third cousins until even Vanderbilt money, even railroad monopoly money, wasn't enough to maintain places like idle hour in the style for which they'd been designed, because every generation produced more heirs, and every heir expected to live like Vanderbilts, and the money, finite despite appearances, couldn't support infinite expansion, couldn't sustain the lifestyle across geometric population growth, couldn't prevent the inevitable dissipation that affects all family fortunes given enough time and enough heirs and enough generations of people who consume rather than produce. Willie K. himself died in France on July 22, 1920, passing away while in Europe, his remains returned home and buried in the Vanderbilt Mausoleum on Staten Island, and while he left millions to his children, his will was still substantial, still impressive, the era that had made idle hour possible, that had made sense of idle hour, that had provided the social context in which a 110-room summer cottage could exist without irony or embarrassment or moral qualm, that era was already dead. Killed not by fire but by taxation and inflation and changing social values and 2 catastrophic world wars and the simple fact that Americans no longer wanted to be subjects in someone else's private kingdom, no longer accepted that birth into wealth justified lifetime leisure, no longer believed that society required a leisure class whose consumption supposedly generated employment and cultural advancement, no longer wanted, in other words, aristocracy, even American improvised aristocracy, even the carefully constructed performance of permanence that places like Idle Hour represented. Idle Hour entered a strange twilight existence, passing through various hands and purposes in ways that would have horrified its original builders. In 1921, a syndicate headed by Frank Elbridge Webb agreed to purchase the estate and convert it into a country club, attempting to democratize, or at least monetize, the Vanderbilt lifestyle by selling memberships to New York's rising middle class, to people who could never afford their own 900-acre estate but who might pay annual fees to access someone else's, to play tennis on Vanderbilt courts and swim in Vanderbilt pools and dine in rooms where Vanderbilts had entertained. Though the venture failed within 2 years, falling behind on payments, the syndicate dissolving in 1923, revealing that even the allure of Vanderbilt glamour couldn't quite support the massive expenses of maintaining the house and grounds, that the economics of country club leisure couldn't sustain what had required industrial-scale railroad fortunes to create. The property then attracted strange visitors, including, according to local legend, gangster Dutch Schultz in the 1930s, as if the house that had represented the absolute peak of respectability now drew criminals seeking temporary refuge, as if Idle Hour's meaning had inverted completely, transforming from symbol of legitimate power into hideout for illegitimate power, from the space where wealth tried to establish its virtue into the space where wealth revealed its essentially criminal nature. And most fascinatingly, portions of the estate were briefly converted into an artists' colony called the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, a delightfully pretentious name for what was essentially a bohemian commune where painters and sculptors and musicians, including figures like George Elmer Brown and Roman Bonnet-Cintas, turned the cow stalls and pig pens of the Vanderbilt farm into studios, creating art in the converted infrastructure of Gilded Age wealth, which feels almost like poetic justice, as if the house was finally being used for something beyond mere display, as if the invisible laborers who'd maintained the estate had been replaced by visible creators who actually produced something. Though even this didn't last, even this attempt to give Idle Hour meaning beyond consumption eventually failed, the artists moving on, the colony dissolving, the buildings returning to vacancy and neglect. The second burning of Idle Hour happened slowly, imperceptibly, through decades of deferred maintenance and changing ownership and the simple, grinding reality that nobody wanted to pay what it cost to maintain such a place, that the house had become less asset than liability, less treasure than burden, less symbol of success than reminder of an era everyone wanted to forget, until 1963, when Adelphi College, seeking to expand beyond its Brooklyn campus, purchased the estate for a surprisingly modest sum and began the process of converting it into an educational institution, and then in 1968 spun off the campus as Dowling College, named after real estate developer and philanthropist Robert W. Dowling, finally giving Idle Hour a purpose beyond private luxury, finally making it serve a democratic function its builders never imagined and probably would have despised. It would educate students, overwhelmingly first-generation college attendees from working-class and middle-class Long Island families, young people whose grandparents might have been servants in houses like Idle Hour, who now walked as equals through halls where Vanderbilts had once entertained European nobility, who attended classes in rooms designed for very different kinds of performance, who studied and socialized and built their futures in a building that represented everything their ancestors had been excluded from, and who probably never quite understood the ghost they were living among, this building that was simultaneously monument and cautionary tale, simultaneously impressive and horrifying, simultaneously beautiful and morally compromised. For nearly 50 years, from 1968 to 2016, Dowling College gave Idle Hour something like dignity, maintaining the structure because institutions, even struggling ones, maintain their physical plants in ways that individuals cannot, preserving at least portions of its architectural heritage because colleges value history even when they can barely afford operations, filling its vast rooms with students and professors and administrative offices and the normal chaos of educational life, with classes and office hours and student government meetings and all the mundane activities that make an institution function, and making it serve a democratic purpose, making it accessible, making it meaningful in ways that private luxury never could be, proving that buildings can be redeemed, can be given new life, can escape the purposes for which they were built and become something better, something that actually serves society rather than just demonstrating wealth. But even this couldn't last forever. Even this repurposing couldn't save idle hour from the economic forces that destroy institutions as ruthlessly as they destroy individuals, because in March 1974, barely 11 years after the college took possession, idle hour burned again, a second major fire that damaged significant portions of the building and required $3 million in renovations. As if the house couldn't escape its original fate, as if flame was somehow essential to its identity, as if even transformation into an educational institution couldn't protect it from the element that had destroyed its predecessor. And then, far more destructively over the long term, Dowling College itself began to fail, slowly at first and then with increasing speed, accumulating debt through mismanagement and administrative mistakes, suffering declining enrollment as demographics shifted and competition from larger state universities intensified, losing accreditation battles and public relations battles, and ultimately the battle for financial survival, until finally, in August 2016, the college closed completely, shutting down operations, dismissing all staff, graduating its last class, losing its accreditation, and abandoning idle hour to an uncertain fate, leaving the building empty for the first time in nearly half a century, leaving it to silence and vacancy and the terrible question of what happens to buildings when nobody wants them anymore, when they've outlived all possible purposes, when they're too expensive to maintain and too historically significant to demolish and too large to convert into anything else. What happened next reads like a horror story for architectural preservationists, like a nightmare for anyone who cares about historic buildings, like a perfect crystallization of everything wrong with contemporary approaches to architectural heritage. The 105-acre site, including the mansion and numerous outbuildings, entered bankruptcy proceedings because Dowling College had creditors, had debts, had financial obligations that had to be addressed before the property could be transferred, and after a lengthy legal process the property was eventually purchased in 2018. For $14 million, a shockingly low price for 105 acres including a 70,000 square foot historic mansion in a desirable Long Island location, by Mercury International LLC, a Delaware-based limited liability company, an affiliate of NCF Capital Limited, corporate entities designed to shield actual owners from liability and public scrutiny. And instead of restoration or adaptive reuse or anything resembling care for this historic property, anything resembling responsibility for architectural heritage, anything resembling recognition that idle hour represented something worth preserving despite its problematic origins, the new owners simply abandoned it, stopped paying property taxes, accumulating over $3 million in back taxes owed to Suffolk County, stopped maintaining the grounds, allowing vegetation to overtake former lawns and gardens, stopped securing the building, allowing vandals to break windows and spray graffiti, stopped repairing the roof, allowing water to pour into the structure during every rainstorm, stopped doing anything except holding the property as a speculative investment or a tax write-off or whatever financial purpose these shell companies serve, essentially consigning idle hour to death by neglect, to a slower but equally effective burning than the one that destroyed the original structure in 1899, to a process of deterioration that will, within years rather than decades, make the building unsalvageable, unrepairable, good for nothing except demolition. Today, in late 2025, if you could somehow gain access to idle hour, which you cannot legally do, because it's private property, fenced and occasionally patrolled, protected by no trespassing signs and the threat of prosecution, though urban explorers and architectural photographers occasionally sneak in to document the decay, leaving behind haunting images that circulate on social media and preservation websites, images that show a building in its death throes, you would find a mansion in ruins. Rooms where ceiling plaster has collapsed in chunks revealing the wooden lath beneath, walls water-damaged and covered in black mold that spreads like cancer through the structure, broken windows that let in weather and wildlife, pigeons nesting in what were once elegant bedrooms, raccoons and possums inhabiting spaces where Vanderbilts once slept, graffiti in what were once grand reception halls, tags and spray-painted messages that marked the building as abandoned, as nobody's, as public in the worst sense, Floors that have rotted through in places creating dangerous holes, staircases that can no longer bear weight, rooms filled with debris from collapsed ceilings and walls, the smell of decay and mold and animal waste, and overall a sense of profound abandonment, a sense that the building knows it has been forgotten, that it's giving up, that it's surrendering to entropy and time and the simple reality that nobody wants it anymore, that it's too big to maintain, too expensive to heat or repair, too tied to a vanished era to serve any contemporary purpose, too much itself to be anything else, too historically significant to ignore but too expensive to save, trapped in a limbo between life and death, neither actively used nor cleanly demolished, just slowly, inexorably, painfully falling apart. The tragedy of Idle Hour isn't that it burned in 1899, or burned again in 1974, or is slowly disintegrating now in 2025, the tragedy is what its rise and fall reveal about American wealth and American values and the terrible bargain at the heart of Gilded Age grandeur, the bargain that everyone understood but nobody acknowledged, the bargain that shaped everything about how these palaces functioned and why they ultimately failed, because Idle Hour was never really a home, was never actually about domestic comfort or family life or any of the things we associate with houses. It was always a performance, always a stage set, always a carefully constructed illusion designed to convince others, and perhaps to convince the Vanderbilts themselves, that inherited railroad money could buy permanence, could purchase belonging, could construct a dynasty that would last for generations, that wealth alone could transform nouveau riche railroad heirs into American aristocracy, that spectacular expenditure could overcome the contempt of old money families, that architecture could literally build social position, and the performance worked, for a while, for a generation, maybe two, because people did come to Idle Hour, did admire its grandeur, did treat the Vanderbilts as American royalty, did accept them into society, did acknowledge their arrival, but the performance required constant energy, constant expenditure, constant maintenance by dozens of servants whose names we don't know, whose faces appear in no photographs, whose stories died with them, who polished and cleaned and cooked and served and made it all look effortless while exhausting themselves in uninsulated attic rooms, eating leftover food, wearing cast-off uniforms, knowing that one mistake, one moment of visible humanity, could cost them everything. The hidden cost of Idle Hour, the cost never mentioned in architectural journals or society pages, the cost that had to remain hidden for the performance to work, was measured in ruined hands and curved spines, in housemaids who died of tuberculosis contracted in damp basement rooms, in stable boys crushed by horses or kicked in the head, in kitchen workers scalded by boiling water or burned by stoves, in laundresses whose hands cracked and bled from lye soap, in the sheer physical toll of maintaining grandeur, in bodies used up and discarded, in lives spent in service to other people's comfort, in the psychological damage of spending your entire existence invisible, of having your humanity denied, of being essential yet effaced, indispensable yet unacknowledged, of knowing that everything you produced, every perfectly made bed, every flawlessly served dinner, every immaculately polished floor, was immediately consumed, leaving no trace, no recognition, no legacy beyond the Vanderbilt name, no possibility that history would remember you, that anyone would care that you existed, that your labor, your sacrifice, your ruined health would matter to anyone. And the terrible irony, the devastating symmetry that makes Idle Hour's story so perfect and so horrible, is that all that labor, all that human expenditure, all those ruined bodies and exhausted lives, couldn't save Idle Hour from exactly what the servants themselves experienced: obsolescence, abandonment, the crushing realization that you're no longer needed or wanted, that the world has moved on and left you behind, that what you thought was solid and permanent was actually contingent, temporary, subject to forces you couldn't control and didn't see coming, that your entire purpose was tied to circumstances that could change, that you were vulnerable in ways you never fully understood until it was too late to protect yourself. Idle Hour stands today, barely stands, listing slightly, its foundations shifting, its walls cracking, as a mirror showing us truths about wealth and power that we desperately don't want to see, truths that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our national mythology, that suggest American capitalism is not a meritocracy but a brutal system of exploitation that creates spectacular winners and invisible losers, that builds monuments on the backs of people it refuses to acknowledge, and here are those truths, unavoidable, inescapable, written in every collapsed ceiling and broken window, fortunes evaporate within 3 generations because wealth without productive purpose consumes itself, because inheritances get divided among too many heirs, because the skills that build fortunes are different from the skills that maintain them. The grandest monuments become real estate problems within a century because buildings require constant maintenance that requires constant capital that requires constant productive economic activity that inherited wealth rarely sustains. Beauty built on exploitation contains the seeds of its own destruction because systems built on invisible labor eventually collapse when that labor becomes visible, when servants become workers who demand rights, when the exploited refuse to remain voiceless. You cannot actually purchase permanence or belonging or immunity from change because social structures are always fluid, always changing, always subject to forces beyond individual control. The performance of having arrived must be maintained constantly or it collapses immediately because social position in America has always been performative rather than inherent, always subject to challenge, always requiring proof through continued consumption. Wealth without purpose turns to dust because money alone, absent productive deployment, absent contribution to society, absent meaning beyond consumption, eventually becomes worthless, becomes a burden, becomes the very opposite of what its possessors imagined. What makes Idle Hour's story so haunting, so impossible to dismiss as merely historical curiosity, isn't that it's unusual. As I mentioned, Long Island's Gold Coast once boasted over 500 such estates, and fewer than 200 survive in any form, with most either demolished or, like Idle Hour, slowly rotting into oblivion, but that it's representative. That it shows with brutal clarity how American wealth operates, how it builds monuments not to last but to impress, how it values appearance over substance, spectacle over sustainability, how it treats human labor as invisible and infinite and essentially free, how it assumes permanence while actually creating elaborate temporary structures, how it performs dynasty while actually burning through fortunes, how it promises legacy while actually guaranteeing obsolescence, and how it ultimately consumes itself, burning through fortunes and families and physical structures with equal carelessness, leaving nothing but ruins and questions and the haunting sense that we should have learned this lesson already, that every generation builds its own idle hour and every generation watches it burn, and yet we keep building, keep performing, keep believing that this time will be different, that our wealth will matter, that our monuments will endure, that our names will last, even as the evidence of our inevitable failure slowly collapses around us, returning, as everything must, to dust.